Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 200. I'm your host, Barnaby Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the award-winning and internationally acclaimed Australian singer-songwriter, poet, and writer, Barnaby Smith. Barnaby.
Barney.
How are you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for that intro that I just can't live up to. Thank you very much. Cheers. Yeah.
But that's literally true, though. That is everything that you have been, plus more, because you're also a journalist. You're also a reviewer and critic as well. Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's true. I did see that. I have noticed that you are been in Rolling Stone. You have been also listened to worldwide as your singer-songwriter. You pull up your Spotify, and you do have followers in other parts of the world too. So okay. Your career in the arts is almost like an onion. You just peel it back more and more layers and more layers. I have been extremely impressed looking at what you've been able to accomplish so far in your career and seeing your expansive list of reviews, some of your journalist work, plus some of your poetry as well. And as I was finding this out, then I found you published an album back in 2019 as well. You wrote all the songs and you made all the songs. So I got tons of questions, and I just want to get a deep dive in having learned more about your career so far. But before we kind of get into it, I wanted to let the viewers and listeners kind of learn more about you as an artist and how you got started.
In terms of writing, I came out of university. This is in the UK. 16 or 17 years ago, and I went straight into a career in journalism then. Since my teenage years, I was always interested in literature and music. They were sort of my absolute, all-consuming passions from about 15 onwards. Like a lot of people, there's nothing special about that, I don't think. But then I guess after an aspect of it was there was so much, I was covering other people's art so much. I thought that it would be interesting to dive into it myself. With music, I didn't really dabble in songwriting or music making much until about in a serious way, until about 2011. Really, I was in a band in London that didn't go anywhere for a year or two, and then when I came to Australia, I hooked up with a childhood friend and was in a duo with him for a few years, and then that sort of dissolved, and I was sort of quite a low ebb with music, and sort of pressed the reset button, as it were, and started work on what became this album. The premise being that I just wasn't interested in wasn't interested in any promotion. I just wanted to make it for myself and maybe a couple of close friends, family members. And so I just sort of embarked on it, whenever time would allow. I didn't really take to it with any ambition in mind, without any objective for a release. Certainly wasn't interested in marketing it or anything like that. It was very personal and low key. I wasn't looking for exposure or anything like that. But it sort of snowed. It through a couple of happy accidents, it did get a bit of interest, but more than I ever anticipated. In terms of poetry, I'm still a very nascent, early career developing in that area, despite having been doing it for over 10 years. That was probably more interesting in how I started doing that. I was living in Switzerland at the time, in Zurich, and in this very bizarre, snowy, foreign city, and that was when I started writing poetry, and I can't really put my finger on why. It was just I started not hearing, but hearing voices that were these sort of capsules of words, and I started writing them down. They were terrible. I would not stand by those at all now. They were, I think, I wasn't writing anything any good for about 4 or 5 years, but now I've done a couple of residencies and published a fair bit, and have a manuscript for that in the pipeline. So yeah, that's those two things, music and writing, have gone alongside each other for a long time, and they are quite different. I think they cater to they rely on different parts of your brain. I think,
Right.
and different, and more importantly, different aspects of your experience of life.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you look at it from the perspective of, say, the passive reader of poetry or listening to music, their impression could say, well, isn't poetry just kind of like lyrics, or is there a different way to create those two?
I'm sure that it is for most people. In fact, a lot of my favorite musicians, when I read about their process, they do this. They write lyrics as poems, and then they set them to music, and that is a process that absolutely mystifies me. That baffles me. I could absolutely never do that. Anyone who can do that successfully is a genius in my book, but I can't do that. So the process of writing words for music comes in a sort of improvised way. It's always music first, and then lyrics come on top of what the musical idea suggests. And I don't know if you've seen that Beatles documentary, Get Back, that came out over Christmas. There's one section in that where they're sort of forming the words for the song Something. And John Lennon says to George Harrison, just keep singing something over the top of this phrase, this musical phrase, and eventually you'll hit the line that you need that has this emotional resonance he wants, because the line started out as it's a famous line in the song, attracts me like a cauliflower, that became attracts me like no other lover. And sort of the process was just keep on sort of repeating the nonsense over the top of it, and then eventually the line will come. And that's closer to what I do than right. Words first. Yeah.
Right. So your album that came out under the name Brigadoon. So real quick, where did Brigadoon? Why was the title the name of?
Yeah.
Your for that?
I know it as a musical, a movie from the 1950s that starred Gene Kelly. And I still haven't seen it since I was a kid, but I'm pretty sure I should look this up. Actually, I'm pretty sure that the idea of the film is that there's this sort of town or village in the Highlands of Scotland, I think it is, that only appears 100 years. And there's these two American tourists hiking through Scotland, and they happen to come upon it when it's appeared for 100 years, and they go in there, and the character of Gene Kelly sort of falls in love with this girl there, and they have this decision to make about whether they stay in this sort of dreamscape of Brigadoon or they come back to real life. And that sort of idea really appealed to me. So it was named after that movie, although I think the sort of folklore of the idea goes back centuries maybe as well.
And then the title of the album is The Itch Factor. What was your inspiration behind that?
That period where I was living in this quite remote part of New South Wales involved a lot of sort of wanting to be somewhere else a lot of that time. It was very isolating and sort of very secluded, and I was very much removed from people and from culture and from society a little bit. And it got very frustrating at times, although it was nice at others. So it was sort of meant to allude to the idea of being just a bit sort of having itchy feet sort of thing, or sort of being a bit uncomfortable in your sort of location and your life, your sort of, yeah.
Right, and you have 15 tracks on it, and it seems as though like that Diamond Hands seems to be the song that is the most listened to.
I think that's just because it got on some playlist somewhere. In America, I think, actually. So I think that explains that one. Yeah, but it's nice that that happened.
Yeah. So before we went live, when we were talking on the air, you had a pretty interesting story behind how you recorded this album.
Yeah. We lived for about 6 years. We lived in this cottage in the hills in northern New South Wales, about half an hour inland from a very famous town called Byron Bay. And down the back of this property, there was a shack, a very crudely constructed shack that was built by the person who lived in this place before we did. And I just turned it into a little studio, very, very primitive and lo-fi. It couldn't have been more rustic. I couldn't record on nights when it rained because I had a corrugated roof and that would be too noisy. There's lots of insect noises and possum noises that made it onto the record that are still there. You asked me before I came on. You asked me about snakes. I had a couple of snake encounters in that shack as well, and it was just very, you're sort of in the wilderness. It was fun. It was good. Yeah.
With the tracks here, as you're kind of mentioning before, it's beautiful. For those listening, go on your Spotify, you listen to your music, and definitely listen to Brigadoon. And because Barnaby, when I listen to this, it's almost like there's this dream-esque folk music about it. Like there's this, and it was very engaging to listen to.
That's it's really nice to hear that you think it's something for everyone, because my instinct is that it's very much not for everyone. It's very sort of it's very its own thing, not for everyone, because it was recorded in such a amateurish, you could say, way. I worry that it's not sort of smooth enough for most people. It's rough around the edges. There's some tracks on there that they're not really songs. They're just sort of sonic statements. Yeah. It's very long. Some of it's very miserable. But also, I really appreciate you saying it's beyond genre as well, because though I think I am rooted in a certain tradition, or sort of, there's lots of musicians who I was influenced by. That was sort of, I never wanted it to be sort of, right. one single genre. So thank you for those nice comments. Yeah.
I mean, when I was listening to it, like my 8-year-old walks in the room and she thought it was nice. It wasn't, my mother-in-law walks in the room. She thought, oh, this is like, there wasn't anything about it that it made listeners to listen more to it, basically, which is what is like the drawing factor of an artist, is that you want people to pay attention to it. So that was definitely something that I really enjoyed. To be honest, I've never put an album on repeat before, but this was the first time I did, because it was easy. And loving, also what I loved about it is because compared to the story behind your album is great, as you said, where you recorded it, put me in there listening to it being recorded. Where other albums are like, this was in a studio. The very fact that it wasn't in a sterile studio made it more engaging to listen to it, because you're listening for things, as you said in the About track. So,
yeah. Well, those are things I've never really heard before. People say to me, because, like I say, I'm a bit like off the grid in terms of music scenes, community, even online. So to hear that is really nice. Thank you very much for that. For that. It's also, I mean, it came out 2 years ago now, so I've had a lot of time to think about it, and whenever I go back and listen to it, I actually think, oh, that was all right. That wasn't too bad. And there's heaps of songs on there. It's too long, probably, for a lot of people. Yeah. And but I think that every one I stand by, I think, which is nice. So yeah, thanks for that.
So what you need to do, Barnaby, is you need to record a second album and do it in a different garden shed.
I had one. It's happening now. I'm halfway through it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And you should have accompanying like photos of what the garden shed is. So then
that's a good idea. I should have. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because some of the best part about is listening, as I say, is knowing the source of where the album is being recorded makes it even more exciting to be a part, because you feel like you're part of the project.
Yeah.
The listener is the second half of the art, so it makes it
absolutely. You're absolutely right. But it took me quite a while to sort of realize that. Like the album had already been out for a while before I realized that, like the sort of story and the setting behind it was part of it. I was sort of like ignored that aspect of it. But after it had been out for a while, I sort of tapped into that when I was trying to make very, very small efforts to promote it, and it did gain traction, like you say. It was sort of part of the overarching narrative of the whole thing. People seem to sort of respond to it. Yeah, because I don't really play live, perform, so I was sort of relying on those sort of weird selling points for it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good. So I want to talk a bit about as well is that the other aspect of what you do from an arts perspective, Barnaby, is you are a journalist and you're a reviewer and a critic, and you've had your stuff on Rolling Stones, The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald. Looking at your bio, you've put stuff out everywhere. I wanted to do a little bit of dive on that to ask you, how different is it for you to create art as compared to looking at art through a critical lens?
Well, there's one crucial distinction between the two things, one obvious one, and that is that all that criticism and that journalism and that writing is my professional life. It's sort of, I do that for a living. And this music and the poetry stuff, I just do as sort of an outlet for some other part of me. I don't really know what to call it. I hesitate with the word creative quite a bit, but it's something else. And they're vastly different. I know it's probably not that healthy to have to compartmentalize it quite that much. And I can't really see any crossover, to be honest, between how I write about other people's art and my own production of what you might call art. So it's a difficult question to answer. And, you know, it's a much drier process, composing criticism.
Right.
It involves a lot more hard work rather than sort of improvisation, obviously.
Right.
And I have to think about it further, but I can't really, to be honest, I can't really see much crossover. They just, like I said before, they engage completely different parts of a person's faculties and modes of expression.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you talk to one of the best pieces of advice people will say, if you're going to write a book, read books. If you're going to make art, go to art museums, learn, like, see other artists. As you look at something through a critical eye, have you been able to then be inspired in the sense to say, like, maybe on your notepad or something, like, that was kind of cool how that person did that. I'm going to kind of keep this aside a bit and maybe utilize that because you have the unique occupation to look at things professionally from a critical eye on a field of work that also inspires you.
This is a difficult thing to formulate. If I'm studying someone else's work and I see something that might be useful for me, that happens very occasionally. The more common thing is that if I'm deep into someone else's work and something hits me, it sort of just goes in to my subconscious. And when it comes around to writing something for myself, whether it's poetry or music, it comes out automatically. It's not I don't really make notes or anything like that. It sort of just goes in. It's sort of like a filter. It comes in and goes out. I don't look for things to sort of transfer from one to the other. But I mean, of course, the more you read and the more you listen to, the more you're going to it's going to feed into your own work. But that doesn't necessarily involve criticism. You know, I do read a lot and I listen to a lot of music, but that doesn't really. And then again, that's a third thing, as distinct from criticizing something. The work of a critic is a very fine art that is evolving a lot in response to the way culture has changed as well. So it's not what it was about 20 or 30 years ago. It's a different thing. And so it's sort of more structured and formulaic than it once was. And that sort of makes it less of a creative process to write a review these days, maybe. You know, if I'm given a book of poetry to review, reading that book is very helpful for forming my own ideas about writing my own poetry, but it doesn't sort of directly inform it very much. Right. It does. It's sort of it gives me more context for my own work, rather than you know, affects it directly.
So talk a bit about that, where you mentioned that the formula has changed over time. Was that something just from a cultural evolution of critics view things, or can you pinpoint a time where it says we need to start doing things like this for X reason?
In the last 10 years, I'd say that the art of the review has changed quite a lot, not necessarily for the worse. If we take music, for example, I'm finding that it's really hard to find a bad review of something, something that really gives something a good kicking, for multiple reasons. I find that unless you're sort of a huge band who can stand to have a bad review, like your U2 or something, bad reviews don't really get written or published these days. And while I understand that you don't want to, push more negativity into the world, I think that the sort of the radar of criticism and cultural values is sort of put off by the fact that there's all this sort of everything's wonderful being put into the world. And I also think it's sort of a disservice to certain works to just blindly say they're amazing. It's actually sort of more useful for that artifact of culture for it to be considered in a way that can be criticized in a respectful and sort of and valid way. And also I found recently that reviews generally aren't things that get clicks anymore, really. People are more interested in what people have said, whether it's on social media or in public or something like that. It's more sort of reviews aren't going to generate clicks, basically. And whereas those sort of news articles that talk about someone saying something salacious are other things that sort of draw people in. There are many outlets that still do this, but they don't make money. So, yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
And so I'm very curious about this as well is we always hear the word critic. We always hear the word reviewer. Are these synonymous or are these two completely different things?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Wow. I'd say they probably are close to being synonymous. It also might depend on what realm you're talking about. There's this sort of very hallowed scholarly idea of literary criticism that exists in the books world that sort of feels like it's elevated beyond reviewer. Because in literature anyway, the word criticism might invoke people like Barthes or Foucault or the sort of highfalutin theorists. So criticism can represent those people, whereas in the world of music, you're just writing about, Kings of Leon album that came out last week, and that's not quite as research. So I don't know. That's a really interesting question, one I probably should think about more. But in the world of music, they're probably interchangeable, but less so than maybe the arts and books. Yeah.
As you know, I like to lovingly say at the time of this recording that we are in the pre-post pandemic world right now. And did you see during COVID how much was the review work and the how was that affected while things were closed down?
No, it wasn't too bad for me anyway. Obviously I couldn't go to anything to review, but I didn't do much of that anyway. I was quite fortunate, and I think that a lot of people in my shoes were, in that the publications that I wrote for were very generous. They made sure that their freelance contributors kept on having work. They just pivoted their contents to sort of focus on things that were being presented online, for example. They allowed sort of articles and work that was more history-based, historical focused, because there was nothing happening. But certain books, and people were still producing in that time. Books and albums still came out, so it wasn't that bad in terms of for criticism. Yeah, for me anyway. Yeah.
You do reviews for. You do it for like art shows. I've seen you do it for films. You do it for books. Do you have? Is there a certain thing that you like to pivot towards more often than not as a medium?
I haven't been writing about music now for quite a while. It's sort of dried up for various reasons, and I really miss that. I wish I could sort of have an outlet for writing in depth about music again. I really sort of have felt that void. But I'm actually finding that I really enjoy writing about movies more than that's relatively new for me. Only in the last maybe 5 years I've started doing that, and I really, really enjoy doing it because I've got an outlet called a magazine called Metro over here that is all about Australian and New Zealand film, with a great editor, and you're allowed to go in all sorts of directions with it. And And so it's a very enjoyable experience to write a 2,000 or 3,000 word essay about a movie where you've got free reign to sort of take it into whichever areas of discussion feel relevant to you. So yeah, writing about movies has been quite a rewarding thing recently. Yeah.
And so the other piece too is like, I've always been curious about this, is how much do you have to be objective about it or subjective? Like, have you been in a position where you're like, I really like this movie, but I know it's so bad, or anything like situation like that? Or like, is it like some sort of like journalistic integrity where you say, how much of it do you have to like whittle down to say this is objectively bad as compared to subjectively good, I guess?
Not something I probably face too much, because I'm in a position to pick and choose what I want to cover. So I don't really have to. If I like something, I think I can probably come up with a way of arguing that it's objectively good, if that makes sense. Rather than saying I like this, but I know it's bad. I think that I would sort of say this is good and this is why it's good, and that's sort of an objective way of looking at it. So I think that's the approach I take. The other angle to that is that I'm very hesitant to use the first person pronoun in criticism. I think I sort of arrived at criticism a long time ago now, and I had a couple of editors when I was young who really hated that, who sort of like said you can do that in features and you can do that in other sorts of writing, but in a review you don't put yourself in it at all. And sort of that's become quite common now. Possibly, and that's no bad thing, but I'm sort of, because of that sort of learning I had back then, I'm sort of hesitant to use the word I in a review. So it's an awkward one, only if I absolutely have to. Yeah.
So we have, as you know, in the world of the arts, pick the medium, whether it be music or books or comics or any types of. What advice would you give to a creator who they have somebody, kind of like send them an email and say, hey, listen, I'm putting out a book now. Can I send you a copy of it and can you review it for me? What would be your advice to someone who's never done reviews? What advice would you give to them to say, what do I need to summarize in a paragraph or two to say something positive about this? Or if they can't, if they come back and say this is bad, I don't want to say anything good. But you're a nice person and all, and I know we've shared ice cream, but I can't write anything good about this book. Or what would be your advice for a situation like that?
The advice from the side of the reviewer, the critic.
Yeah.
You mean? Like I said earlier, if something was really bad, I mean, it's very rare that would you be contacted. Well, it's not that rare. It happens plenty. But if to be contacted directly by the person who made it, there's often a PR or a person in the middle to do that. There's so many things go into that question. The finances of it. If you're getting paid to do it, then you need to do it. I'd say.
Okay.
A lot of, and you need to find a way of getting your judgment across whilst being respectful and nice. You've got to make sure it's any criticism you give something is well conceived, well worked out, and expressed in a way that is makes sense and is respectful. I guess. What
would you like? Say it's a friend. It's a friend of yours who just did an indie publishing book. They just put out a book on Amazon or and they say, hey, I want to put a blurb on the back of my book. Can you give me something?
Oh yeah, I'd probably do that. Do that. I mean, I'm in a position where I actually run a magazine for a writers' festival in Australia. Called Byron Writers Festival. The magazine's called Northerly. So if that exact scenario happened to me, it'd be easy for me to say yes, of course. If you want to promote something for your book, can you write something for us? That would be a way of promoting it, or we can run an extract or something like that. So I'm in a position where I can help people like that without having to make a judgment on the work, and I do all the time. If I was just a freelance writer, and this is the case with music now, a lot of the time, someone gets in touch with me and they say, can you help us out with coverage of this? Can you review this somewhere? Even if I really, really like it, which has happened plenty of the last week. I mean, I don't have an outlet at the moment for music writing. So often my excuse is really interesting, like this a lot, but I don't have anyone to write for at the moment. So if that changes, I'll let you know. So, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I'm sure other people who might be in that position have much more outlets and much more opportunity to publish. But for me, there's a few ways out of that scenario. Like, yeah.
So, with your day job being a critic, and then also you know, you're making your music and writing your poetry, how are you able to kind of split up your day doing these things?
Well, my day job is actually, I now have a sort of proper day job. I'm not freelance anymore. I work part-time as a sub-editor for a magazine now. So that's sort of the baseline of income. And everything else I do comes on top of that, which is in some ways is good in that it means I can take less work that I don't want to do. I can say no a bit more, as I have done. And I can focus on my own projects. In terms of the structure of, you know, the day or week, it's the same as it ever was, you know. If it's not raining, I'll go out into the garage and try and record of an evening. And if it's raining, I'll do some writing instead, or whatever. So it's sort of grabbing an hour or two here and there in the evenings and being disciplined about it. The discipline side of thing is hard because often you just don't want it for various reasons. Especially with a job now. I think it's a pretty common story. People have to sort of really make themselves find the time at the expense of lots of other things to get their own projects going and find momentum with them. So I'm in that boat, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Good. So Barnaby, if people want to follow your work, what's the best place they can go to?
In terms of the music, the Bandcamp page is a good one. I do have a Twitter account that is
So Barnaby, people can find your Twitter handle is at a Barnaby MS, and that will be in the show notes. And the work you've done on there, you have on there already is like your brigadoon stuff is on there. You have all of your links that you've had for some of your articles is on there as well.
Yeah.
It is a lot, actually. You got a lot of stuff there. Cool.
The Bandcamp link is brigadoon.bandcamp.com as well, and that's where you can purchase said record we were talking about. Yeah.
Yep. So people can find you on Twitter. People can also find you at brigadoon.bandcamp.com. And also, anybody's interested, that you do have a lot of your reviews are available also on the AustralianBookReview.com. Also, you have it, the Art Guide Australia has a lot of your more recent articles on there as well. So very exciting stuff. So listen, Barnaby, you have to come back on when you have your second album come out.
Oh, cool! I'd love to. Yeah, thank you, Barney.
Yeah, it would be amazing.
Might be a while.
Yeah. you got the shed. You've been making it, so yeah. And then absolutely cool. Well, this has been so fun, Barnaby, talking with you. I'm so happy that we've been able to connect.
Me too. I'm really, really grateful that you got in touch, and I was really honoured to be involved. It's the first time I've done a podcast, so thanks very much.
Have an extremely all right, hang on, let me edit this part out though. Extremely? That's not even a word. All right, 20 third, I think it was like 20 minutes 30 in there. All right,